This PowerPoint presentation will focus on narrative movement and the dramatic arc. So when you're writing your own narrative, you always want to be aware of how it's moving. It's got to be moving towards something. If it's not very interesting. The dramatic arc is a very typical model that we use to think about this type of narrative movement. It starts with an introduction, something happens, we have a lot of action that's moving towards a climax, big thing, falling action, things are resolving, and then the end. This is a very typical sort of method to use it. Doesn't mean that your narrative has to look exactly like this, but you definitely want to keep it in mind as you start to craft it. As we think about it, any kind of story that we tell has to be moving towards something, towards that climax. If it isn't moving towards something, it becomes very tedious, very boring. You could think about a story. I got up this morning, I got out of bed, I brushed my teeth, put my clothes on, I brushed my hair, I put my makeup on, I went downstairs, I got something to eat. Very boring to listen to, right? Instead, if I started a story with something like, when I woke up this morning, I could tell that something was going to happen. I had a feeling in my gut. When I went upstairs or downstairs to get something to eat, my cat looked at me funny, and I didn't know what was happening. Now I'm starting to build towards something. You're more interested in what's going to happen. So make sure in your own narrative, whatever it looks like, that you're trying to build towards that. The idea of this dramatic arc has its roots in ancient Greece. It's a very old, very Western idea of storytelling. Aristotle is the one who said that plays should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. There should be sort of that sort of focus towards something. And we later have adapted this into stories. And this narrative arc has come from scholars looking at stories over time and trying to figure out what do they have in common, what are their common characteristics, and this kind of movement is something that they've noticed. Today, contemporary American society, our stories definitely don't always look like this. In fact, a lot of times we shift that climax towards the beginning. I'm sure you can think of a television show or a movie where the climax or the end happens at the beginning, and then you go back in time to kind of figure out how that's happening. Sometimes things are very mixed up. That's a very postmodern way to think about it. The climax and the dramatic movement is kind of all over the place. But there's still movement, still going towards something. The changes, the differences, are sort of the things that keep us interested. So wherever you choose to put your climax, wherever you choose to have your elements of this narrative arc, just make sure it's intentional. It's something that you feel like the reader is going to keep their interest, that they're going to be wanting to read, wanting to know more. Okay. So the first part of that dramatic arc is the exposition or the introduction. It sort of gets things started. I'm going to use the example of Cinderella as you do this, but you could do this for just about any Disney movie, a lot of really typical movies. Star Wars would be a good one if you're familiar with it. Lord of the Rings, something like that. All follow this sort of thing. So in an introduction section, it introduces the main characters, sets the scene. There's a lot of different ways that we do that. Think about Cinderella. We have to learn that she had a mom, that the mom passed away, her and her dad were buddies, that she's a good girl, she does what she's told, she's sweet, she likes nature. All that stuff is in the introduction section, setting the scene. We get to learn about her. An inciting incident is something that happens when a problem or conflict is introduced. This kind of drives the rest of the story. Something happens. And in Cinderella, that is, father gets remarried to the stepmother. That's a big problem that sets everything else in motion. So we want to think about that. Make sure you have something like that, something that's setting things in motion in your own narrative. The rising action is the intensity of events that are kind of increasing as it goes. So it's building and building towards something. They've got to be unified, building towards the same thing. The climax is depending on this. So the rising action in Cinderella, stepmom and stepsisters aren't kind to her. There's a ball, they're not going to let her go, they make her do the dishes. All that sort of stuff is building towards something. Dad dies, perhaps be another one. We've got a lot of rising action that's building towards a big climax. Climax is that turning point. Events, situations change for better or worse. In a traditional comedy, usually things have gone from bad to good. In a traditional tragedy, things have gone from good to bad. So in Cinderella, I think the climax would be the ball. She goes to the ball. It's a big thing. Things change. Prince falls in love with her. She dances. And then she has to run away. So that's something we want to think about. Climax is so important to a story. It's what everything's moving towards. So when I see these personal narratives, a lot of times students kind of forget that. It's got to be building towards something. It's not just a collection of random stories. It's a collection of stories that should be building towards a big one, a big thought, big concept, big idea. So do keep that in mind. The climax is not the end, though. Usually, after the climax, some more difficulties are confronted, some more things have to happen, there's more suspense, but things are kind of moving towards a wrap-up. For here, this would be, of course, that Cinderella has had to leave the ball, Prince doesn't know where she is, he's coming around with the shoe, stepmom locks her in the room so she can't try it on, etc. So we don't know what's going to happen to her, necessarily. The resolution, or the denouement, that's a very nice French word, is that everything is reconciled. Everything is wrapped up. Normal things happen. Good characters usually end well, bad characters end poorly. Everything kind of works out. She tries on the shoe, Prince realizes it's her, they get married, etc. So we have everything kind of wrap up. Again, in a comedy, traditional comedy, things are usually better than they were at the beginning. For Cinderella, it's certainly true. In a tragedy, things are generally worse off than the beginning. Someone's died, something's happened. So just again, this is sort of our narrative arc. Introduction section, have to set the scene. Something happens, we have some events that are building towards a climax. That usually results in a couple of things that lead to a final resolution. It's generally, from the beginning to the end, some sort of a transformation, a change. Certainly that's true of Cinderella. She's now a princess, married to the prince, as opposed to a servant in her father's house. There's a lot of different stories you could use to do that. We just did Cinderella. You could also sort of think this through with the movie Frozen, The Lion King, as I said before, Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, just about any superhero movie will kind of work for this. So do keep in mind, in your own narrative, you do not have to follow this exactly. It's very typical, again, to say the climax at the beginning, show how we got there, and then wrap it up at the end. But you might think of even other ways to do it. But do feel like your narrative is moving towards that climax. It's moving towards something. It's got to have that movement, or else it's going to lose your reader's interest really easily.